Okay, so this is where we left off with chapter 5. This picture is in your book on page 116. You guys don't have to worry too much about this. This is something, though, that you should have learned about in A&P1. This is just showing a negative feedback loop, and occasionally this type of feedback loop, would be considered another version of inhibition, but it's a more natural type of inhibition. It's basically how cells control, which enzymes are on and which enzymes are off, that kind of thing. So basically, the end product in this whole pathway actually has an effect on the first enzyme. So the end product of this, chemical reaction is actually behaving like a non-competitive inhibitor, which turns off the enzyme because we have enough of the end product. This is actually very similar to how the thyroid hormones are controlled in the body, which again, you should have learned about in A&P1. All right, so just like humans, okay, bacteria, they love carbohydrates, they love sugars. And we all know that carbohydrates have to all be broken down into glucose before cells can actually use it. So glucose is used to make ATP, and again, in AMP2, right, not ATP2, AMP2, right, in your Anatomy and Physiology 2 class, there's a chapter called Muscle Metabolism, and you're going to learn all about how eukaryotic cells, using the mitochondria, take that glucose and turn it into ATP. So it's a pretty big topic in AMP2, all right? But for us, of course, we're talking about bacteria. So bacteria can do all kinds of stuff that, that human cells can do and human cells can't do. So aerobic respiration refers to metabolism using oxygen. And for the most part, that's what our cells do, is aerobic respiration. We definitely need oxygen for sure, okay? But there's also anaerobic respiration. Anaerobic respiration means without oxygen. So metabolism that does not require oxygen. One example is glycolysis, which is, it happens in human cells first to the glucose, and then bacteria cells have all kinds of different, types and versions. And then there's fermentation, which we will also, mention or talk about. So, some bacteria use something other than oxygen as the final electron acceptor in their respiration, in their metabolic pathways. Again, you'll learn more about that in AMP2. If you're not sure what that means, not a big deal. Bacteria can use nitrates and sulfates in their metabolism, which is very important to the nitrogen and sulfur cycles in ecosystems. So, we mentioned about how bacteria keep the ecosystems going by constantly recycling and using certain chemicals and all that. Methanogens are bacteria that actually produce methane as a byproduct. Methane is natural gas, so we actually use methane in that way. So, it's another way that bacteria are actually utilized by humans to produce something they want, or, we use something that they make. For the most part, anaerobic respiration is not as efficient, and it does not create as much ATP as aerobic respiration would. But it kind of makes sense. I mean, our bodies, are made up of billions and billions of cells, so of course we need lots and lots of ATP. Bacteria, they're just one cell. It's one single cell is the organism. So they don't need nearly as much ATP as our bodies do. All right, so if you don't know what pyruvate is, it's okay. That is another thing that you're going to learn about in AMP2 if you haven't had that class yet, or if you are in it right now, which would be pretty rough taking micro and AMP2 in the summer. but you know, you gotta do what you gotta do sometimes. So in fermentation, fermentation is definitely anaerobic, no oxygen at all. If you don't know what Krebs cycle is, that's okay. Once again, that's an AMP2 thing when you talk about muscle metabolism. Essentially, fermentation is just not nearly as complex, doesn't have nearly the number of stages, and it does not produce nearly as much ATP. So the only two types of fermentation you guys need to know, if this was a higher level micro class, you'd have to know a whole bunch of different types. We're only going to worry about lactic acid fermentation and alcohol fermentation. Those are the only two types that you really have to worry about. So lactic acid fermentation is something that lots of bacteria can do. It's also something that our muscle cells can do if they're deprived of oxygen. So if you're working out really, really hard and you're working out so hard that your muscles, like you can't breathe in enough to keep up with your muscle demand, your muscles can do lactic acid fermentation, but that's actually what causes muscle soreness. So it's not a good thing long term. And then, of course, alcohol fermentation, that's how things like yeast and various other types of bacteria produce alcohol or ethanol. So the alcohol that's in beer, wine, all the different types of liquors, that's all ethanol. So Streptococcus and Lactobacillus are two of the most common species, it's really a genus, but whatever, that perform lactic acid fermentation. So we actually utilize this lactic acid fermentation process to make things like yogurt, cheese, sauerkraut, and pickles. And then the main species of yeast that's used in alcohol fermentation is called Saccharomyces. Saccharo means sugar because this is yeast that loves sugar and it produces alcohol. It also produces carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is what causes bread to rise. When you bake bread, the yeast is eating up the sugars in the bread. That causes the release of carbon dioxide, which makes the bread rise. They are also producing alcohol, but as the bread bakes, the heat will actually cook the alcohol away, and then obviously every time you have bread, you don't get drunk. So obviously the alcohol is gone, but it's also how we get beer and wine and all that kind of stuff as well. So, you know, why do we care about all this stuff? Well, this stuff we can use to identify the bacteria, identify the bad guys, right? So we need to know what type of bacteria is making our patient sick so that we can kill it. So we can make the patient better by, you know, killing the bacteria. So that's why we really care about bacterial metabolism, is we can use it. Now, not only can we use it for things like beer and wine and bread and yogurt and all that, but when it comes to our focus in our class, the human health and diseases, you know, that's why we need to know this stuff, is so we can identify them based off of the chemicals that they use or the chemicals that they produce. And that brings me to this chart. This chart is really cool, has lots of cool information. Students don't tend to like this chart quite as much as me, but you know, that's okay. And this chart is in your book, and it is on page 138. So what is this? Well, this is a diagram that can be used to identify all organisms, at least all known organisms on Earth, based off of their metabolism. All right. So the first two branches, okay, would be the energy source. So how does the organism obtain energy? Do they do it from chemicals or do they do it from light? If they use chemicals, we use the term chemotroph. Chemotroph, chemo means chemical, troph means feeding. Okay, so feeding off of chemicals, chemotrophs. All right. If the organism uses light, photo means light, so they are phototrophs. Okay? So now let's stay on the left-hand side. We'll do the right-hand side, you know, next, all right? So chemotrophs. Two possibilities. Either they ingest or absorb organic materials, or they absorb carbon dioxide. If they absorb organic compounds, they are called chemoheterotrophs. Okay, hetero means other. Okay, so they have to eat other things. That's basically what that means. They have to eat other chemicals, other compounds, other materials. Okay. Now we do the final electron acceptor thing. The final electron acceptor thing is part of the metabolic processes in the cell. And a lot of times that final electron acceptor is oxygen. That brings us to the little yellow box, which is kind of like our final answer type of thing. So who are the chemoheterotrophs that use oxygen? Okay, all animals, which includes humans, almost all fungus, lots of different types of protozoa, lots of different types of bacteria. Okay, so those are the chemoheterotrophs. Those are the ones that we as humans can relate to, right? Humans, in order to get energy, we have to eat. We have to eat food, right? Organic compounds, we have to eat carbohydrates, proteins, fats. That's what we eat. We eat organic compounds in order to obtain the energy that we need to stay alive. Okay, so all animals, most fungus, protozoa, and lots of bacteria. Okay, now if oxygen is not used, that's when we talk about the chemoheterotrophs that are anaerobic. So they do some sort of fermentation, they do some sort of anaerobic metabolism, which we mentioned those before. Okay, so the one example down there that I mentioned is Streptococcus that does lactic acid fermentation. Okay, going back up to the CO2 level, that group is a very unique, very unusual group. Okay, the chemoautotrophs. That mean auto means self. So they have to use a carbon source, which is CO2, but they're not eating anything. They're just absorbing the CO2 from the air. They're not actually like eating the way that like humans eat. We call them oxidizing bacteria. So these are bacteria that oxidize things like hydrogen, sulfur, iron, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide. Kind of a weird, unique group of bacteria. We're not going to worry about them too much. Okay, those are really not bacteria that are going to come after us and make us sick. Okay, then we go over to the other side for light. So the photoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs are organisms that produce their own food using light. That should sound sort of kind of familiar because that's what plants do. Okay, so plants, algae, and cyanobacteria are photoautotrophs. They use the light energy from the sun to make their own food, and they don't have to eat. Okay, and then you've got that one little group over there, the green and purple bacteria. They are photoautotrophs, but they do not produce they don't produce oxygen. They don't give off oxygen. So they're not as helpful as plants and algae and cyanobacteria. And then finally, the weirdest group of all are the photoheterotrophs, the green and purple non-sulfur bacteria. Very, very weird group. They use light energy, but they have to still consume organic compounds in order to do their metabolism. Very, very weird group. Okay, so for the test, you need to know what are the chemoheterotrophs, what are the chemoautotrophs, what are the photoheterotrophs, and what are the photoautotrophs. So treat those 4 terms as vocabulary words. I think chemoheterotrophs probably the easiest one because that's what humans are. Photoautotrophs is kind of easy because that's what plants are. The 2 groups in the middle are definitely the 2 weird groups. All right, that'll do it for chapter 5.